The year was 1984, and young Theodore Martin was playing basketball in his front yard. The remote Kansas town they lived in looked almost post-apocalyptic. With a total population of 500, it was located high on the horizon of the Blue Hills. Noticeable only by the silhouette of the rickety old wooden church on the skyline, the town of Nicodemus was one of a simple lifestyle, such as farming and milling. Theodore was only 14 years old at this point, and although a skinny child with thick-framed glasses which housed lenses that wouldn't look out of place in a telescope, he was, in fact, a very talented individual. He was particularly adept at the creative arts, and also took a deep interest in wildlife, and the different types that resided in the nearby lakes and forests. He used to disappear for hours, sometimes days, into the woods. He'd pack up his little one-man tent and trudge off into the distance, distinctive in his knee-length brown shorts, white shirt, and braces. His parents would smile to themselves as they watched him leave. He was ridiculed and alienated by the rest of the villagers. He was repeatedly beaten by the older children of the village, and pelted with rocks as he walked home from school, which only enhanced his desire to be alone and frequency of his disappearances, which after some time began to worry his devoted parents. When Theo was 18, he applied to go to college in Columbus, Ohio. He was accepted and due to enroll that coming fall, majoring in wildlife studies. His parents couldn't have been prouder. Their son was leaving the small-minded community and giving himself a chance at a normal life. Or so they thought. In the years that followed, Theo took a deeper interest in veterinary studies and took a part-time vacancy at a local surgery. Unfortunately for him, he also was interested in the art of taxidermy, which alienated him from his roommates as they saw this as freaky and macabre. Things took a turn 5 years later, after graduation, when he took a job at a local wildlife center and a strange, unhealthy interest in what became of the animals that died. Now 25 years old, he rented a small one-bedroom apartment in a less than desirable part of town, fraught with gun crime, prostitution, and drugs, police sirens sounding at all times of the day. Theo was becoming frustrated. He was doing well at his work, finally making friends, and it seemed like life was going well. But no matter what he tried, he just couldn't shake his obsession with death. So much so that it started to take over his life. He started skipping work, firstly just knocking off a couple of hours early until he was very rarely there at all. This led to his dismissal and took him on the journey on which we were about to embark. Theo spent his final paycheck on a beat-up old bronze-colored GMC Gremlin and began traveling the country roads looking for roadkill. After hours on the road, he'd make his way home and lock himself in his apartment for days, sometimes weeks at a time, working on his creations. After some time, Theo would reappear, looking rather downtrodden, carrying the reinvented images of the animals he had searched the back roads for. He had brought the animals lovingly back to their former glory and decided to take them to the local markets, to keep the bucks coming and a roof over his head. Soon, though, the animals alone were not enough for him. He needed more. He craved it. He was becoming more and more frustrated with the life he led, and this drove his passion for death to new extremes. It became more and more unpredictable. Mood swings overtook the pleasant young man that he had become. Slowly, he recoiled into that 14-year-old recluse he once was. It was several weeks before Theo was seen again. By this time, gone was the old gremlin, only to be replaced by a Chevy van. He was looking even more disheveled and haggard, unshaven with his clothing crumpled and dirty. He ambled towards the van. It was around 7:30 p.m. as the engine rumbled to life with a plume of smoke escaping abruptly from the rear. As he set off, no one could imagine the horrors of what was to come. Theo found himself crawling the curbs of the local red light area, carefully selecting the young girls, who didn't look too embroiled in the life and still had some innocence about them. The first girl to climb unsuspectingly into the dirty Chevy van was 17-year-old Elizabeth Goldsmith, a student from the nearby high school who turned tricks to feed her increasing heroin habit. It was several days before she was reported as missing by one of the other girls. Her parents were used to their daughter disappearing for nights on end, so were not unduly worried. Almost a week later, her naked body was found lying by a dumpster in the alleyway behind a soul food cafe. As the police cordoned off the area, and the coroner looked more closely at Elizabeth's body, he noticed that both of her eyes had been carefully removed and her tongue had been cut from her mouth. It wasn't quite the horrifying sight he expected to see. Inside his tiny little apartment, Theo was sat carefully working on a fox he had found dead by the side of the road. As it stood proudly on the table, he sat back and admired his work for a brief moment, and as he stared into the stunning green eyes that once belonged to the 17-year-old dead girl, he beamed with pride. Also noticeable was Elizabeth's tongue, just poking out from the left-hand side of the face. Over the next several months, 6 more girls were to disappear. All were found posed by a dumpster in the back alley, and all were naked with their eyes and tongues removed. Police officers were baffled as to why the parts were being removed, and what was becoming of them. They were soon to uncover the true horror of their discoveries. Infuriatingly, inquiries were leading nowhere fast, until one evening a keen young woman noticed that the same downbeat van had been roaming the streets for the last week, at the same time, every night. After giving an extremely detailed description of the van and its downtrodden driver to the police, Theo was eventually arrested on suspicion of 7 counts of murder. Upon the searching of the van, pools of blood on the floor showed under the luminol, and a large roll of polythene was also seized. During his questioning, the police also exercised a warrant to search his property, inside which they found several examples of his macabre hobby, foxes and badgers all recreated back to their former beauty, although using human eyes and tongues to replace their own. After several hours of intensive questioning, Theo finally confessed to the murders, but he couldn't explain why he committed them. And so on the 22nd of November, 2001, aged just 31, he was sentenced to die by means of lethal injection. He remained incarcerated on death row for the next 15 years, when on January 17th, 2016, he was escorted to the execution chamber where he was strapped to the specially designed gurney, with his arms splayed out wide. At precisely 10:13 a.m., Theo was administered the fatal injection, watched by the local governor and a few members of the general public, including the families of some of the victims. By 10:15 a.m., he was declared dead by the warden, and tears flooded from the watching families as they realized that even though justice had been carried out, their loved ones were never coming home.